Greetings, welcome to our video presentation. We're talking about the context of Matthew 24, the overall big picture, which is helpful to interpret Matthew 24, a very famous chapter of the Bible. It's called the Olivet Discourse. It can also be found in Mark 13 and Luke 21. And there's our website and email if you'd like to see that and contact us. Feel free to stop the video at any point to read the scriptures, ponder these thoughts, to pray, take notes, write questions down. Love to hear from you after you see this. Let's move along. Before we get to Matthew 24, it's paramount to see what leads up to it. So Jesus was sent to the Jews. You see there in the top left of the column, he states that he was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Matthew 10 there, he also sent the disciples out, told them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now in Luke 3, 7 and 9, John the Baptist, in his ministry, he reprimands the Jews, he warning them of the wrath to come, telling them to bring forth fruit worthy of repentance, and that fruitless trees are to be cut down and cast into the fire. Now notice how that connects here with what Jesus spoke about in Luke 13, 6 to 9. Jesus spoke a parable about a fruitless fig tree in a vineyard. Interestingly, the vineyard is Israel. You can read that passage in Isaiah. We're going to talk about the vineyard here, too, in a moment or two. Now, after 3 years, the gardener wants 1 more year to fertilize it and give it 1 more year to produce fruit, and if not, then cut it down. Remember what John said, we just talked about in Luke 3. All right, interestingly, in Matthew 21, 18 to 20, Jesus literally cursed a fig tree, and it withered immediately. Top right there in the Good Samaritan parable, in Luke 10, it's the priest and the Levite that avoid the needy man and walk by on the other side. These guys are supposed to be the true representatives of God's plan and religion, yet they are the one that avoid the needy man. Now in Matthew 8 there, Jesus tells a Roman centurion that he's found faith like no one else he's seen in Israel. Didn't find it in a Jew, he found it in a Roman centurion of all people. There in Luke 12, Jesus spoke to the people that they were able to discern the weather, but not their present time. Very crucial. Similar in Luke 19, before cleansing the temple, Jesus wept for the city Jerusalem for not knowing their day, the thing that would bring them peace. He also spoke of them being surrounded by armies and tearing down the city because they didn't know the time of their visitation. Moving along, as it says in John 1:11, he came into his own received him not. Now in light of this and the previous things we've looked at the end of Jesus' ministry here, he further declared prophetic judgments against the nation, the city, the leaders, and finally the temple, which we will get to in Matthew 24, which is what this is all about, the context of seeing the big picture. Top left in Matthew 21, Jesus used the vineyard parable to declare a judgment on the apostate nation of Israel. Remember we talked about the fig tree and the vineyard. Now here's the vineyard parable. Vineyard is Israel, Isaiah 5 there if you want to read it. The owner, God, sends his servants, who are the prophets, to the vineyard Israel. They are beaten, killed, and stoned. You can read those verses. Last of all, he sends his son Jesus, saying, they will reverence my son. The workers in the vineyard kill the son to get his inheritance. Ironically, that's what we all get because of Jesus' death. Then there's the coming of the owner of the vineyard. Very interesting. The owner of the vineyard comes. When he comes, he destroys the evil workers in the vineyard. You can read those passages there in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Bottom left, Jesus then declares the kingdom would be taken from Israel and given to a nation producing the fruit God wants. 1 Peter 2:9 deals with that. Chosen generation, a royal priesthood. You can read that if you'd like. Top right now. Now vineyards produce grapes, obviously, that produce wine. Vineyards have a grapevine and a wine press. Interestingly, in Revelation, it says they are drunk on the harlot's wine. You can read those passages. In Revelation, the judgment is described as the wine of the wrath of God. You can read Revelation 14 and 16 there. Furthermore, the judgment is also described as treading the winepress, the vine of the earth that's cast in to the winepress of God's wrath. There in 14, 19 and 20 and 19, 15 of Revelation. You might want to stop and read all these passages. Very, very crucial. Now, Jesus used wine to represent his blood. There in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. Jesus also described himself as the true vine we must abide in to bear fruit. Remember, we talked earlier about trees that don't bear fruit. They're cast into the fire. Bottom right, the vineyard Israel produced one true vine, Jesus Christ. Or we could say Israel produced one perfect Israelite. Moving right along. Now in the very next chapter, Jesus uses another prophetic parable to declare judgment on the city of Jerusalem. Here in Matthew 22, if you want to stop and read that, he gives the parable of the king's marriage for his son. As in the previous parable, there were servants. In this parable, they invite guests to the wedding, and those invited made light of it and went their own way. Once again, the others who were invited treated the servants spitefully and killed them, just like the previous parable in Matthew 21. The king became angry. He sent his soldiers, killed those murderers, it says, and burned their city. Matthew 22, 7. Now, many scholars agree this is referring to 70 A.D. when the Roman armies destroyed Jerusalem. Now, following the reference to the destruction of the city, the wedding is ready. Now, top right, as in the kingdom parable in Matthew we just talked about, with the king's marriage for his son in Revelation, or marriage of the Lamb, and the bride there also in Revelation 19:7. Now, the bride in Revelation being those who were invited who also came to the wedding, as implied in this parable we just spoke about in Matthew 22. Those outside the city in Revelation 22 compares with the man in Matthew 22 who was cast out of the wedding for not having a wedding garment on. Now, the soldiers killing the murderers and burning up the city from the parable in Matthew 22 is exactly what the Romans did in AD 70. Interestingly, this is also exactly what we are told the beast in Revelation does to the harlot city. You can read that in Revelation 17 and 18. And, as in Matthew 22, after the city in Revelation is destroyed, the wedding follows. Coincidence? Let's move along. Once again, in the next chapter, we find more declared judgments. This time it's against the Scribes and Pharisees. Top left there, Matthew 23, Jesus points out the hypocrisy of the Scribes and Pharisees. And Matthew, those verses you see there in the second line down on the left, 7 woes are pronounced on the Scribes and Pharisees. Matthew 23, 30 to 35, Jesus uses very strong language to indict the Scribes and Pharisees, the very ones who would have him crucified just a few days later. This goes right along with the prophetic judgment declaring parables in the previous 2 chapters, but here it's not a parable anymore. He's speaking and directed it right at them. There in Matthew 23, 35 and 36, on them would come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. It would all come on their generation. Matthew 23, 37 to 38, Jesus uses the name of the mother city to represent those guilty of all the righteous blood shed on the earth. Bottom left, telling them in verse 38, behold, your house is left to you desolate. He's referring to the temple. Top right, interestingly, is in Matthew 23, there are also 7 woes in Revelation. Now, we saw the vineyard parable in Matthew 21 and what looks like a connection in Revelation. Is this just by chance? We saw the king's marriage parable in Matthew 22 and the things that appear to connect in Revelation. Coincidence? Remarkably, just as the mother city Jerusalem in Matthew 23 is guilty of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, The mother city, the harlot, Mystery Babylon, is also guilty of all the righteous blood shed on the earth. You can see that in Revelation 16, 17, 18, and 19. Coincidence? Moving right along. Now we get to Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple, Matthew 24. We've seen some of the context leading up to it. Now let me read that passage there, 1 and 2. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, there shall not be left here one stone on another that shall not be thrown down. Top left there, it's likely Jesus spoke everything from Matthew 21 through 24 on the same day. After declaring judgment on the nation, city, and the leaders, now it's the temple. The disciples had some questions about when it was to happen. First, let's look at the first part of their question in Mark's account. In Mark 13:4, part A, they ask, Tell us, when shall all these things be? Now the first part of the question in Luke's account in 21:7, part A, and they asked him, saying, Teacher, when shall these things be? Lastly, let's look at the first part of their question in Matthew 23, part A. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? What things? Well, the things obviously from Matthew 21, 22, 23, and now predicting the temple's destruction. To see the parallel accounts of that, you can see those scriptures on your bottom left. Top right now, the temple was the centerpiece of their religious life. Hearing Jesus predict it was coming down would have been a huge impacting statement. Be like hearing the Twin Towers in New York City would be coming down before they did. Now let's look at the second part of their question in Mark's account, Mark 13:4, part B. And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Now the second part from Luke's account in 21:7, part B. And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Lastly, the second part of their question from Matthew's account, Matthew 24:3, part B. Notice this now. They ask, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The King James Version has the word, the end of the world. Age is the more accurate translation, as scholars agree. Notice the second part of the questions are different only in Matthew's account. What does this mean? Moving along. Only one specific event was predicted, which prompted the disciples' questions about that one specific event. Top left. What's in Mark and Luke's account as, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished, is in Matthew's account as, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. The question to Jesus about his coming appears to be directly connected to questioning him about when the temple would be destroyed. The disciples witnessed Jesus' indictment of the apostate Jews throughout his ministry. They heard Jesus declare judgments on the nation, city, and leaders in the 3 previous chapters, likely all on the same day. With all this in mind, how could they ignore all that and then suddenly ask Jesus about his coming if it had no connection? In their mind, his coming, or presence as the Greek word says, was directly connected to the destruction of the temple, which is why they asked specifically about it. Top right, interestingly, the Greek definition of the word translated coming in their question in Matthew 23, in the Strong's lexicon there, G3952, from the present participle, a being near, that is advent, often return. Notice the underlined part. This is their definition. Strong's Concordance lexicon. Specifically of Christ to punish Jerusalem, or finally the wicked, by implication, physical aspect, coming or presence. The same exact Greek word is translated as presence in 2 Corinthians 10:10 and Philippians 2:12. Now at that point in time, the disciples didn't even grasp the reality of Jesus going to heaven, much less his second coming in our future. Even after his resurrection and being with them 40 days, speaking of things pertaining to the kingdom of God, they were still thinking he was going to restore the kingdom of Israel as they asked him there in Acts 1. You can read those scriptures. To think they were asking Jesus about a second coming in our future at that time is illogical and doesn't fit the context of everything that's going on here. Moving along. One other question found only in Matthew's account is also directly connected with the destruction of the temple, as all the other questions are. Take special note of the following, in their top left there. Question in Matthew 24:3 about Jesus coming was conjoined with their question about the end of the age. As I mentioned, the King James translators use the word world. It's more correctly or accurately translated as age, and the scholars generally agree on this. All right. The temple was the centerpiece of the Jewish age in the first century. Its destruction would clearly mean the end of the age they were in. Undoubtedly, the disciples' question about the end of the age was directly connected to Jesus' prediction of the temple's destruction. Now, would the disciples be asking about an age they weren't in yet, an age that had no connection whatsoever to the temple? That doesn't make sense. Top right, Jesus predicts the end of the temple. The disciples ask about when it will end and when the end of the age will be. Just 2 verses later, Jesus states, "And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See thee be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Now, this was during what was known as the Pax Romana, which was a relatively peaceful time in the Roman Empire at that time. You can look up Pax Romana. You'll see that on Google search or something. This reference to the end appears to be in connection to Jesus' prediction of the end of the temple and the disciples' question about its end and the end of the age. Would Jesus be trying to confuse the disciples by speaking of a different end just 2 verses later than their question? Moving along. A couple other relevant factors to help with the context of Matthew 24 and this Olivet Discourse, also in Mark 13, Luke 21. There in Matthew 24:32, top left, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When its branch is still tender and puts out leaves, you know that summer is near. So likewise, when you see all these things, shall know that it is near at the doors." The statement, "all these things," clearly puts them all into one group for only one time frame. Then Matthew 24, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation shall not pass until all these things are fulfilled." Here's another direct statement to tie everything up to verse 34 into just one time frame. If I say this day, this week, or this month, it's crystal clear what time frame I'm referring to. Notice Jesus didn't say that generation or these generations, but he stated this generation. Top right there, Matthew 12:43-45. "When the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places, seeking rest, and findeth none. Then he saith, I will return into my house, from whence I came out. And when he is come, he findeth it empty, swept and garnished. Then goeth he and taketh with himself 7 other spirits more wicked than himself. And they enter in and dwell there, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. Even so shall it be also unto this wicked generation," as Jesus states. He spoke this directly to the Scribes and Pharisees, the very ones who arranged to have him crucified, and the ones he rebuked there in Matthew 23. Their generation was unique. They were the ones that saw God in flesh walk the earth like no other generation in history ever has or will. After declaring the 7 woes in the Scribes and Pharisees, Jesus stated in Matthew 23:36, "Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation." Bottom right there as we wrap it up. With all this connected to Jesus' declared judgments on Israel in Matthew 21, taking the kingdom from them, on Jerusalem in Matthew 22, declaring the armies would destroy those murderers and burn up their cities, the Scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23, guilty of all the righteous blood on the earth, as it also states of the harlot city in Revelation, and the temple in Matthew 24. Would the statement, "this generation" in Matthew 24 be referring to a different generation than in Matthew 12 that we just read about in 12:45, and just one chapter earlier in Matthew 23:36. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and thank you for watching, listening. I welcome any comments or questions, and may God bless you richly. In Jesus' name.